Welcome to the Brief News Network.
If you truly want to grasp how a war is unfolding, forget the battlefield maps. Turn your eyes to the bond market. At this very moment, the Russian government is discreetly preparing to issue domestic bonds to plug its enormous federal deficit, not denominated in rubles, but in Chinese yuan, right inside its own borders. Pause and let that sink in. We spend every waking hour analyzing drone footage from Eastern Europe. We debate congressional funding packages and weapons deliveries. But while the West burns through tens of billions and Russia feeds an entire generation of young men into a grinding conflict, there is precisely one country quietly walking away from all of this, dramatically wealthier, strategically more powerful, and completely unscathed. A nation that has not discharged a single weapon. If you want to cut through the partisan noise and grasp what is genuinely at stake, hit subscribe, because the true victor of this war has never set foot on the battlefield. And we just stumbled headfirst into a trap that was 3 decades in the making. When you study the history of modern economic warfare, a very recognizable pattern emerges. We know exactly how the script is supposed to read. When a country violates international law, when it launches an unprovoked campaign of military aggression, the response from the global community, and specifically from Western financial powers, is engineered to be immediate, overwhelming, and suffocating. The objective is to isolate the aggressor so thoroughly that its capacity to wage war simply runs out of oxygen. We witnessed this playbook executed against apartheid South Africa. We watched it grind away at Iran across many years. We have seen it deployed against rogue governments across the globe. And in February of 2022, when Russian armored columns crossed the Ukrainian border, Washington and its European partners unleashed that very same playbook on an unprecedented scale. Truly unprecedented. This was not a matter of slapping sanctions on a handful of oligarchs or freezing a few banking accounts. The West dropped an economic nuclear device. Within days, Russia was effectively severed from the global financial architecture. Its major banks were ejected from SWIFT, the secure international messaging backbone that allows money to flow across borders. Exports of critical technologies were banned: semiconductors, aviation components, industrial machinery. A price ceiling was imposed on Russian oil in an effort to strangle the primary revenue artery of the Kremlin. And in a move that sent shockwaves through financial markets worldwide, the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russia's central bank foreign currency reserves. $300 billion, locked away, inaccessible, overnight. The prevailing consensus in Washington, London, and Brussels was clear. This was the terminal blow for the Russian economy. The immediate fallout seemed to validate that assumption. The ruble cratered, collapsing to barely more than a fraction of a cent against the US dollar. Long queues of panicked Russians wrapped around ATMs in Moscow and St. Petersburg, desperate to withdraw their savings before the entire financial structure gave way. Hundreds of Western corporations, from McDonald's and Starbucks to Ford, Volkswagen, Apple, and BP, announced their departure. The triumphant narrative wrote itself. An impenetrable financial wall had been erected around Russia, cutting it off from the civilized world. The expectation was unambiguous. Deprived of Western capital, Western technology, and Western markets, the Russian war machine would rapidly run out of steam, starved of the resources required to survive, let alone sustain a massive ground offensive. And yet, here we are, years later. The Russian military apparatus has not ground to a halt. The Russian economy has not crumbled into ruin. In certain sectors, it has reorganized and stabilized in ways that continue to sustain the conflict. So how does that happen? How does a country get locked out of the entire Western financial ecosystem, lose $300 billion in central bank reserves overnight, face the most sweeping sanctions regime in modern history, and still manage to keep its factories running and its munitions flowing? To answer that question, you have to stop fixating on what the West did and start paying attention to what happened immediately afterward. Because yes, we constructed a financial fortress around Russia to quarantine it from the world. But we left the back door wide open. And standing right on the other side of that door with open arms and an open ledger was Beijing. If this analysis is helping you see past the daily noise of the news cycle, hit the like button. It tells me to keep digging into these structural transformations rather than chasing daily headlines. Because what follows is the chapter that will define the next 100 years of global geopolitics. When the West sanctioned Russian oil and gas, cutting off the lucrative pipelines to Europe that had bankrolled the Russian state for decades, Vladimir Putin found himself sitting atop millions of barrels of crude with nowhere to move them. Europe, long dangerously reliant on Russian energy, was painfully extricating itself. Putin desperately needed a buyer. Enter Xi Jinping. China stepped in and began purchasing Russian oil and natural gas in massive, historically unprecedented volumes. But not at market price. Naturally not. Beijing understood that Putin was cornered. So China extracted steep, punishing discounts, securing Russia's most prized natural resource at a fraction of what Europe had previously paid, channeling that cheap energy straight into the furnace of its own manufacturing colossus. Initially, Western analysts and policymakers waved this off. That is just opportunism, they said. China being China. A temporary lifeline. A discount commodity grab. Nothing structural. That dismissal was a historic miscalculation of the First Order. Because what began as an opportunistic energy arrangement was, in reality, the opening move of a comprehensive macroeconomic takeover. Let me put it plainly. China did not throw Russia a lifeline. They threw them a leash. The Russia-China relationship has always been layered and complicated. Historically, they have been cautious partners and occasional rivals, sharing a vast border and a mutual wariness of American power. But before 2022, Russia maintained a meaningful degree of economic autonomy. It sold energy to Europe. It purchased German machinery, French luxury goods, American technology, Japanese vehicles. It had leverage. It had alternatives. Western sanctions obliterated those alternatives. By sealing Russia off from Europe and North America, the West inadvertently handed China the keys to Russia's entire economic infrastructure, gift-wrapped and delivered. Consider the automobile sector. Before the war, the showrooms of Moscow and St. Petersburg were populated with Volkswagens, Fords, Toyotas, and Renaults. When those manufacturers exited in 2022, the market collapsed, but it did not stay empty for long. Walk into a Russian car dealership today, and you are not shopping European. You're looking at a Haval, a Chery, a Geely. Chinese automotive brands that barely registered in Russia before the invasion now dominate the entire national market, captured without a single shot fired. But this goes far deeper than the automotive sector. It reaches into the circulatory system of a modern economy, technology, and industrial machinery. When the West banned semiconductor exports and blocked industrial equipment shipments to Russia, the stated objective was to cripple its manufacturing base. You cannot assemble a modern battle tank, build a cruise missile, or even operate a functional civilian logistics network without microelectronics. So where is Russia sourcing them? From China. Today, Chinese manufactured components, from basic voltage converters to sophisticated microelectronics, account for an estimated 60 to 80% of critical electronics found in Russian drone production and military hardware. Beijing maintains plausible deniability by classifying these as dual-use items, goods that theoretically serve civilian purposes, like consumer electronics or commercial drones, but which invariably find their way into the Russian military-industrial complex. This is not trade. This is total dependency. Before the war, only a sliver of Russia-China bilateral commerce was settled in their own currencies. The overwhelming majority, like virtually all global trade, was transacted in US dollars or euros. Today, over 90% of bilateral trade between Russia and China is being settled in rubles and yuan, completely outside the dollar system. Repeat that figure because it is the single most consequential data point in this entire story. Over 90%. Not by design. Not by ideological preference. By sheer necessity because Russia has no alternative. The Russian economy is being forcibly de-dollarized in real time. When we discuss the source of American global power, we instinctively reach for the military, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, forward bases spanning the globe. But the true bedrock of American supremacy over the past 8 decades has not been firepower. It has been the dollar. The absolute, uncontested dominance of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. If you wanted to purchase oil anywhere on the planet, you needed dollars. If you wanted to participate in large-scale international trade, you settled in dollars. This arrangement granted the United States what economists call an exorbitant privilege, the ability to run enormous deficits, borrow at suppressed rates, and above all, weaponize its financial system against adversaries. The very sanctions deployed against Russia in 2022 derived their devastating power from dollar dominance. But by locking Russia out of that system so completely, Washington inadvertently forced Moscow to demonstrate that a post-dollar world is not only theoretically conceivable, it is operationally viable. And Russia did not have to engineer an alternative from the ground up, because China had been quietly assembling the scaffolding of a parallel financial architecture for over a decade. China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, was designed from inception to rival the Western SWIFT network. For years, adoption was sluggish. Countries had no compelling reason to abandon the liquidity and stability of the dollar ecosystem. But the 2022 sanctions on Russia were the single greatest promotional event in CIPS history. Overnight, Russia became the ultimate stress test. And the rest of the world has been watching with intense, silent attention. Nations across the global south, governments throughout the Middle East, and even traditional American partners like Saudi Arabia have observed the West freeze the sovereign reserves of a major world power. They have absorbed that image. And they have quietly asked themselves a deeply unsettling question. If Washington can do that to Russia, what stops them from doing it to us? That anxiety, that dawning awareness of financial vulnerability, has catalyzed a global pivot that China is actively orchestrating. Every barrel of Russian oil purchased in yuan, every Chinese industrial machine acquired in rubles, adds another brick to this alternative financial ecosystem. And it chips away at the very instrument, economic sanctions, that the West has long relied upon to enforce global order. This is where the strategic elegance of Beijing's approach becomes genuinely difficult to argue with. China has not deployed a single soldier. It has not risked a single warship. It simply stood at the margins with open arms and an open balance sheet while the West methodically drove Russia directly into its embrace. Consider the sheer asymmetry from Beijing's vantage point. The United States has committed tens of billions in direct military and financial support to Kyiv. European nations have stripped their own military inventories to supply artillery, armored vehicles, and air defense systems. The Western defense industrial base is straining to match the consumption rate of munitions on the front line. We are expending real national wealth and depleting physical strategic assets while facing mounting domestic political resistance. Russia, for its part, is consuming its own future. It is absorbing catastrophic casualties. It is experiencing a severe brain drain as its most talented young citizens flee conscription. It is converting its entire national economy into a wartime command structure with zero peacetime sustainability. And China? China is simply doing business. Extremely profitable business. It functions as the monopolistic supplier to a captive market of 140 million people, with zero competition. If a Russian industrial plant needs heavy equipment, it buys Chinese. If a Russian transport company needs commercial trucks, it buys Chinese. If a Russian consumer wants a smartphone, they are reaching overwhelmingly for Xiaomi or Realme. There is no negotiation on price, no leverage on quality, no credible threat to look elsewhere, because there is nowhere else to go. China has achieved total market dominance in a G20 economy, not through innovation or fair competition, but through the accumulated geopolitical errors of its rivals. And this dependence is now embedded at the level of infrastructure itself. As Western technology companies vacated the Russian market, Chinese tech conglomerates moved in systematically. Telecommunications grids, data routing architecture, digital infrastructure, all of it is being progressively rebuilt around Chinese hardware and software, which means that virtually every piece of data, every private communication, every financial transaction flowing through the Russian Federation is increasingly transiting systems engineered and ultimately governed by Chinese state-aligned corporations. The sovereignty that Vladimir Putin claims to be fighting a war to preserve is being hollowed out from within. He has mortgaged the Russian state's entire future, and Beijing holds the deed. We must ask ourselves, when historians revisit this period 50 or 100 years from now, what will they record? Will they write about shifting border demarcations in the Donbass? Will they catalog the congressional battles over aid appropriations? Or will they document the precise moment of fading European power, in a desperate grasp for imperial revival, handed its entire economic architecture and strategic independence to a rising Asian superpower? We are witnessing a tectonic realignment in global power, camouflaged as a regional war. We are watching the consolidation of a Eurasian bloc, anchored by Chinese capital and fueled by captive Russian resources, that is explicitly engineered to challenge and ultimately dismantle the Western-led international order. But the central contradiction of this story, the one figure that fundamentally reframes our understanding of how this war concludes, is larger than it initially appears. Because this is not only about what China has accumulated while the conflict rages. It is about what happens the day the shooting stops. There is a comfortable assumption circulating in Western capitals that once peace is negotiated and a treaty is signed, the global economy will somehow recalibrate back to its pre-2022 configuration. That assumption is not merely incorrect. It is dangerously delusional, because the trap we walked into does not spring open when the ceasefire takes hold. That is precisely when the trap slams definitively shut. For several decades, the global economy operated on a very particular form of institutional inertia. Supply chains were constructed around efficiency and cost above all else. Russia supplied the raw inputs, the energy, the minerals, the agricultural calories. The West supplied the sophisticated machinery, the financial infrastructure, the high-value technology. It was an equilibrium. A fragile one, but an equilibrium. That equilibrium is now gone. Permanently. And it will not return because China has spent 4 years erecting a replacement that is physically and structurally irreversible. Consider the infrastructure dimension. The phrase pivot to Asia is typically deployed as a diplomatic abstraction. But in the material world, a pivot looks like thousands of miles of high-pressure steel buried deep underground. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline is no longer a blueprint. It is transitioning toward operational reality. This is not a standard trade agreement. This is bypass surgery on the global energy market. For 50 years, Russia's energy infrastructure was oriented westward. The pipelines ran to Germany, Italy, Poland. Putin could threaten to close the valves, but he could not physically redirect the pipes. He was as structurally bound to Europe as Europe was to him. But China is now finalizing the central corridor that will channel 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, drawn from the same Yamal Peninsula fields that once heated Berlin, directly into the industrial core of northern China. Once that pipeline is complete, the leverage Europe once wielded over Moscow dissolves. And the leverage the West holds over Beijing dissolves with it. China is locking in a land-based, sanction-proof energy supply that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, avoids the South China Sea choke points, and does not pass through any maritime corridor where the U.S. Navy still dictates terms. By enabling Russia's economic survival through the war, China has effectively neutralized the single greatest strategic vulnerability of the Chinese Communist Party: energy insecurity. A dependency that Western strategists have long identified as Beijing's Achilles heel has been quietly, methodically, permanently addressed. This leads us to perhaps the most uncomfortable realization in this entire analysis. We are told that by backing Ukraine's defense, we are upholding the rules-based international order. And, at a moral and legal level, that argument carries genuine weight. But examine the strategic ledger honestly. The West is currently committing upward of $40 billion annually in military assistance to keep Ukraine in the fight. We are consuming 155mm artillery shells faster than our industrial capacity can replenish them. Our defense budgets are stretched to their structural limits. Russia, meanwhile, sustains its air campaign through a supply chain that China facilitates at a fraction of the cost. In 2025 and into 2026, Data indicates that Chinese origin components constitute 60 to 80% of critical electronics embedded in Russian-manufactured drones. The total value of these dual-use imports from China, the microchips, optical sensors, propulsion systems, runs to approximately $4 billion per year. Absorb that ratio. The component pipeline that keeps Russian drones in the air over Ukrainian cities costs roughly 1/10 of what the West spends annually just attempting to counter them. We are locked in a high-cost, high-attrition competition. China is running a high-margin, low-risk supply operation, effectively subsidizing a war that simultaneously exhausts both of its principal geopolitical competitors, Russia and the United States. And here is the dimension that warrants genuine strategic alarm. While Washington has been engineering 19 successive rounds of sanctions against the Russian economy, Beijing has not merely been circumventing those sanctions. It has been studying them, cataloging them. Every time the U.S. Treasury devises a new mechanism to compress a Russian financial institution, China's central banking apparatus identifies a corresponding method to insulate its own system. Russia has become a 140 million-person live laboratory, an operational testing ground for understanding exactly how Western financial coercion functions, and precisely how to construct an effective shield against it. China is de-risking its own financial exposure, accelerating its domestic payment infrastructure, and ensuring that by the time it might face a comparable confrontation, the West's financial nuclear option will be largely defanged. So when this war finally ends, and all wars eventually do, what does that world look like? It will not be a world in which Russia returns to the European orbit. That bridge has not merely been burned, it has been demolished, salted, and the ground paved over. What emerges instead will be a Russia permanently subordinated to Beijing. A nation that once conceived of itself as a co-equal superpower will have been reduced, functionally, to serving as the resource extraction base and energy supplier for the Chinese century. For the West, the landscape will be one in which our most formidable strategic instrument, dollar dominance and the power of financial exclusion, has been materially, perhaps irreversibly, eroded. We will confront a Eurasia more deeply integrated, more structurally resilient, and more explicitly adversarial to Western interests than at any moment since the peak of the Cold War. The ultimate victor of this war will not be the side that captures 10 miles of contested territory in the Donbass. It will not be the side that holds a triumphant press conference in a ruined capital. The winner is the silent partner who waited. The one who purchased the oil at a steep discount, supplied the microchips at a premium, and watched with studied patience while the West expended its financial reserves and Russia expended its human ones. In the end, Vladimir Putin did not reconstruct a Russian empire. He simply cleared the terrain for a different one.
Welcome to the Brief News Network.